Hi, everybody, and welcome back. First thing we are going to do as we launch our criminology class is we are going to talk about deviance. I'm going to do 2 lectures on deviance, and the reason I do this is you have to understand the difference between deviance and crime, and you have to understand what crime is before you can understand theoretical explanations of crime. So I want to first start talking out about deviance. How do we define deviance? So I want you to keep in mind that what is deviant in one geographic location may not necessarily be considered deviant in another location, which makes it really hard to come to consensus. How do we agree on what is and is not acceptable behavior? So there is an objectively given definition of deviance, and that is that there is the assumption of a general set of norms, behaviors, and conduct that we all largely agree upon as appropriate behavior. And the counterpart to that is that we all agree on what is inappropriate behavior. This defines what is and what isn't deviant. So we can get really specific with this, right, when we're talking about deviance, right? And I like to introduce this by saying that not all crime is deviance and not all deviance is crime, right? There are levels of deviance that are socially tolerated, that do not break the law, right? And I want to distinguish those by breaking this down further. So the first we have is norms, which are rules of behavior that defines people's actions, and it can be broken into 3 categories. And those 3 categories are going to be folkways, mores, and laws. Folkways are everyday norms. If they get violated, they don't get a strong social reaction. So, for example, getting into someone's personal space, right? We here in the United States, we expect about a 1 square foot of personal space around us. If somebody gets into your personal space, it makes you uncomfortable, it irritates you, but you're not going to get arrested, right? You might get a dirty look, you might get some negative social feedback, but not much. Mores is derived from the word moral. Okay, these are norms that are likely to produce a stronger social reaction if they're broken. So, for example, infidelity, alcoholism, polyamory, right? Infidelity, it's not illegal, right? But most people frown on spouses cheating on one another and are uncomfortable with the concept because we've defined that as inappropriate socially. That's a more. There's going to be a stronger negative pushback on breaking the more of infidelity than there will be on breaking a folkway. And finally, at the top of the hierarchy, we have laws. And this is our strongest norm because it carries a formal sanction when it's broken. Laws are rules that we all agree upon that are actually codified. We write them down, we publish them, and we publish the sanctions, so that everybody knows that if you break this law, it's going to come with X consequence or X punishment. So I want you to know the distinction, right? I also want you to know the social constructionist conception of deviance. And this is a definition of deviance that is determined by interaction within society. So from this perspective, there is no such thing as any behavior that's inherently deviant, not even murder, right? The social constructionist conception essentially says we as human beings define what is acceptable and what is not. Everything is neutral until we apply that social construction of deviance. Okay, so the critical conception of deviance is that all understanding of deviance is established by those in power. Pretty much the people who are in a position of power define what is acceptable and what is not, what is legal, what is illegal, according to what benefits them and according to what they're comfortable with, rather than looking at the perspectives of any other groups, right? So that has a real power dynamic to it. So getting back to the question of what's deviance or the difference between deviance and crime, well, deviance will violate your norms, your folkways, and your mores, sometimes your laws, right? But crime is always a codified law that's a rule that we've agreed upon socially that is being broken. So there are measures of deviance that we give social value. People find it uncomfortable, people find it unpleasant, but we tolerate it. In fact, sometimes we're attracted to it. There are TV shows that surround deviance. So My Strange Addiction, if you've ever seen that, which follows people who have really odd addictions like eating bars of soap or eating hair or eating plastic and they can't stop. Those are definitely acts of deviance, right? That sort of boggle the mind. But it doesn't mean that they're illegal acts. Unhealthy, not socially accepted, absolutely, but not violent. Or excuse me, well, it's not violent, not illegal. Sister Wives is another good example of that documentary show all about a polyamorous marriage. By and large, that is it is, although it is polyamory is illegal in some states, there are many states where it is not, but it definitely violates norms folkways and mores. Socially, we are not comfortable with somebody having multiple spouses, and it gets a lot of social pushback, but it also gets a lot of voyeurism. People are curious about it. And a final example would be Dr. Pimple Popper, right? People are drawn to this show where, it shows a dermatologist, lacerating and popping lesions. It's really disgusting, but it's not something that's illegal. Enjoying that, seeking that out is in fact deviant, but it's not illegal, right? So I want you to keep that distinction between deviance versus lawbreaking. I also want you to be aware of a guy named C. Wright Mills. He's a very famous sociologist, and he developed something called the sociological imagination. And the sociological imagination is pretty much a fancy way of saying context. That C. Wright Mills argues you can't understand an individual or their behavior unless you look at the context, the social context, the historical context in which this individual is behaving. Certainly, there are behaviors in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s that were acceptable that are deemed completely unacceptable in 2022. And that's sort of C. Wright Mills' perspective that you have to look at the historical context and the social context in which people are demonstrating behaviors and judge their behaviors of whether or not they're deviance or lawbreaking based on the standards of that era, because those standards change over time. We also have a concept that I want you to be aware of called pathologizing. And this is making the automatic assumption that the person who engages in deviance is mentally ill. This is not necessarily true, or automatically assuming there's something wrong with this individual because they are engaging in deviance. Some people just march to a different drummer, and that's okay. Some people just see life from a different perspective and approach things in a different capacity. This doesn't mean that they are pathological. This doesn't mean that they're mentally ill or that there's something wrong with them per se. It could mean that, but it also could just be that they come at life from a different perspective. This perspective of pathologizing puts all of the accountability on the individual without looking at social forces and questioning social forces and saying, hey, this isn't socially acceptable, but, should it be? Maybe it's really not that big of a deal. Maybe this is a norm or a moray or a folkway that has hung on for too long and we've, evolved beyond it socially. So we have to look at the larger context of society, both historically, socially, and in terms of how are we defining acceptable versus unacceptable behaviors. So I want to finish this lecture up with just defining what a theory is, because the reason I'm presenting all of this to you is to build us up to be able to understand the way in which theories explain deviant and criminal behavior. And you can't understand that if we don't know the distinction between criminality versus deviance. They do intersect, as I said, sometimes, but not always. There are many things that are deviant that are not illegal. There are many things that are criminal that we maybe don't always agree about whether or not it's deviant. The age-old debate on marijuana smoking comes up as an example. So I want to define for you what a theory is. And a theory is a systematic understanding of society's behavior. We study behavior scientifically. We don't make willy-nilly assumptions or assertions. We develop a hypothesis. We say we think this is why crime is happening. And then that hypothesis is tested by data, by measuring people's behavior and seeing, is there support for my assertion or is there none? Or is there strong support? Is there weak support? And one of the biggest things that comes out of all theory is if there's support for my theory, what policy implications do we walk away from? If my theory is supported, how can I instruct people to minimize crime and deviance based on my criminal explanation of deviant and violent or criminal behavior? Okay, I will see you guys next, and we will continue on with our deviance discussion.